You're listening to 15 Minutes of TM1 with, brought to you by CubeWise, managing complexity in the business world.
Welcome to another episode of 15 Minutes of TM1. Now today we've got a special guest, Mark Weller, who's been a legend when I first started TM1. He's been introduced to me as the guy who does everything amazing. And then now 10 years later, I'm meeting in person here in UK on day 2 of the TM1 User Conference 2023 in London in the IBM's Innovation Center. So, glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
This is kind of exciting in a way, because you're such a nice guy, but you're also a legend in our time. So, I don't know if I've introduced you properly. Do you want to add or subtract anything from what I've just said?
Well, I guess I'm currently working for CubeWise here in the UK. I've been working here for since 2010. I used to work in the CubeWise Sydney office, and I've worked at TM1 for many years before that as a end user, developer, you name it.
You name it. All right, so that's great. That's a great segue to my first question, which is, since you've worked with TM1 for such a long time, how did you come across TM1? Was it by pure chance? Or was it by your design because you just wanted to do TM1? Like, what was it?
I'd love to take credit for it, but to be honest with you, it was a colleague of mine who worked. I used to work for a publishing company in Sydney, Australia, and had worked for them for a number of years. We went through the normal process that people go through, which is evolution from spreadsheets to a technology. And the technology we had at that time was pretty good in terms of showing the numbers, but very, very clunky when it came to putting those numbers together. So, for example, when you loaded data into the system, you didn't just load leaf level data, you had to preload every consolidated number, you had to pre-calculate every calculated number, and that took a bunch of time.
How would you do that? Would you do that on spreadsheets, or would you use another app, or was it SQL?
So it was a completely independent application with its own ETL tool, so it could connect to data sources similar to the way TM1 does. But it just had to go through this process of every possible branch and direction of consolidation. It had to preload and pre-create. So the amount of actual energy to load leaf level data was probably not that big. The energy to do everything else was huge, right?
Oh, wow,
so it just took a bunch of time, right?
Yeah.
So a colleague of mine, I was in one part of the organisation, a colleague of mine who was in the finance department at the time had just got a trial version of TM1.
Okay.
Showed it to me. I worked in the distribution department, and we simulated what we did in that product with TM1, and all the consolidations were immediate, all the business rule calculations were immediate, and we just said, where has this been all of our life?
Okay, so let's put some context around that. That was beautiful. What year was that? Not to give your age away. Yeah.
I can tell you this, it was TM1 version 2.5 that came on a floppy disk in a cardboard packaging, and I would say I've worked for CubeWise for 13 years, and it would have been at least 5, 6, 7 years before then. So I'd say probably 20 years ago.
Wow. And so at that time, when you had to update numbers, I guess when people look at numbers, typically is at a consolidated level.
Right.
So if someone missed a journal or they needed to change number, I wanted a perspective of how long would it take to repopulate everything to get your end report?
It depended on what cube you were loading and things like that, but I would say it's certainly measured in hours, never minutes or seconds. And if you were on deadline to get a board pack done, and somebody said, I need to make a last minute change, the first question you asked is, how material a change are we talking about? Because it's going to take the next half day before you get a number. And you have to print everything back in that time. Everything was printed, etc. So, only material changes were accepted late in the day for all those reasons.
I just had a sensation of cold sweat when you described that problem, because you're producing a board pack. Obviously, people need to change.
Yeah.
Maybe I can't get it done on time if I was the person who was going to make that decision.
Right.
But
because all the data was pre-consolidated, it's not just changing data that's an issue, it's changing metadata. So if somebody says, oh, I want that account to now roll up over there instead of over here, then all those consolidations that are preloaded are useless now. So, and you couldn't do a delta, you had to redo the whole thing all over again. Rebuild the model, reload the data. So it was really like building the house from the foundation up every time you wanted to change something.
Okay, and then when you moved into TM1 on the floppy disk, how long did it take? You mentioned it immediate. Would it be seconds or minutes?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because obviously I go back a fair way with TM1, and I was talking to somebody about this the other night, but the first version of TM1 we used to load data in, we didn't have Turbo Integrator. So the way in which you loaded data was a little different, which was you took a file and you would load the first line of that file into a spreadsheet, write all the relevant formulas, add in missing dimensions, all that kind of stuff in the spreadsheet, and then hit a menu item that would process every line of that file and effectively DB send every single cell that came in from that file.
Oh, I see.
So initially, it took a little bit of a time to load that data in, and then somebody said, have you tried Turbo Integrator? We ran it through Turbo Integrator, and it took a fraction of the time. So at that point, we're talking seconds and minutes. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I've been spoiled. So the first time I touched TM1 was Turbo Integrator.
Right.
So yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So okay. So that was a long time ago. You got introduced to TM1. Was that the kind of like the decisive moment for you that you knew TM1 is something you want to work on? Or was it much later?
It wasn't instantaneous, and which is an interesting thing. I think a lot of people see TM1, and I think I've already said to you there are a few things that are clearly better than previous technologies, but I would say it probably wasn't instantaneous for me. I think it was probably only after the conclusion of maybe that initial implementation, learning some stuff, thinking I'd do it differently if I did it again the next time around, and then doing like project number 2 and project number 3, that the light bulb really went off for me. And I think that's probably when I moved more into financial models. So at that time I was working on models around supply chain, and when we move into financials where the CFO and CEOs of companies want to make changes all the time, and their business is so dynamic, they're acquiring business units, they're selling business units, that you had to be that quick. It's only then you appreciated how nimble TM1 really was compared to all the other products we had dealt with.
Right. Oh, so true. Now, then peeling back from background, from what you described, you probably sounds like you were in finance?
At some point, probably early in my TM1 journey, I joined the finance team. I wasn't from a finance background, but yeah, I became a systems accountant at that point in time.
I see, okay. And how long did it go for until you reached the next level of TM1? Is that a fair way to put it? Because, you know it's good, and then you get really great at it, and then,
I had a few stages, I think. There was a point in time where I thought I knew everything about TM1, and then I joined CubeWise and realized there's a few guys who know quite a lot more than I do, sort of thing. So I think it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know until somebody else shows it to you. And I think when I first used it, it was a lot for things like reporting general calculations and consolidating numbers. And then when you got into things like cost center allocations, it's a real step change. So now you're using Turbo Integrated to sort of programmatically and in a very sequential way, just really churn through all those numbers that you'd previously just been loading as is from your ERP. And so I would say things like cost center allocations was a real change for me, where I, again, appreciated that TM1 was able to do this so quickly.
Right.
And there were some challenges, and I think as versions got better and better, it became easier and easier, but certainly that was probably my first real step change, I would say, things like that.
Was that your light bulb moment at that point?
I think I probably had the light bulb moment when I came under the pressures of month end and how flexible and easy it was to change things. I think allocations was just that next level of capability that we kind of unlocked.
Yeah, that's true. Now, over all this time, since the time when you had to do allocations, it sounds like it was a while back, and it's a common business problem, yes?
Right.
And it hasn't changed that. I mean, I guess the scale is probably bigger than before, but the nature of it's still the same, right? Or would you say it's different?
I would say based on now where I am today, I certainly came away from my early days of using the product in one organization for a long period of time, assuming that everybody did everything exactly the same. And of course, the themes are the same, a P&L, a balance sheet, a cash flow, an allocation. But the execution of it is often quite different. And allocations is one of those ones where I've seen quite a few variations on A, what an allocation is, and B, how to perfect it. And that's where you get even that next step. And this is where, having joined CubeWise and been around the guys who've done many iterations, is, well, now it's not about how accurate the number it is, it's how fast it runs. So now you're talking about parallel processing, you're talking about running multiple threads concurrently and how you break that up, and then you're into a whole different sort of area about it's no longer just the numbers, it's the mechanics of this, the logic of this thing to squeeze every second you can and get the best result in the shortest possible time.
It almost sounds like you're describing when art and science combines.
Right, that's right. The great, yeah, absolutely. It was the logic and the execution and the elegance of how you build those things could just save you such a lot of time, right?
Right.
And I always prescribe to this less is more principle. The more complicated you make it, chances are the longer it's going to take. You're not looking to add, you're looking to hone this thing down to its most efficient version, right?
Chisel it down to the absolute perfection.
Right.
Yeah?
Take away everything you don't need.
Yeah, okay. So, since then, what has been your favorite standout feature in TM1 personally for you?
That's a really good question. I would say probably, to me, it's always when it's given us major performance boosts. I think there was times where locking, certainly with a system where there was a large number of users, things like locking were always very consequential. True. And so things like parallel interaction and the way in which data loads were being done in such a way where they weren't locking the cube for other people doing reads and writes at the same time. To me, that was probably a big change because the performance of the system just went exponentially greater. And that's also the point at which you spend all this money on a server with all this RAM and all these cores, all of a sudden you're utilizing every bit of it. Whereas up until that point, everything was quite serialized and you weren't getting as much performance. So I would say probably parallel interaction was a big one. And I think any time that we saw step changes in performance always made a big impact.
Right, okay. Yeah. So then, with this, the future release and the current talks of how IBM is going to change the architecture or the engine, whatever we would choose to call it,
right,
or however other people want to call it, would that be something you view as exciting, or is this just a natural progression of TM1 keeping up with the times? Like different people have different views. What's your view?
I think probably the latter for me. I think it's important that the technology is aligned with like the best practices of the day, right? Whether that's cloud computing, whether that's high availability using things like Kubernetes and things like that. I think those things are enablers. The most important thing is that the core logic that exists in TM1 is as valid today as when it was first invented. So those core principles around the functional model and how TM1 fundamentally works, its design, its the way it manages hierarchies. I think actually to your earlier question, I think hierarchies is a huge step forward for me as well. Being able to actually build cubes with virtual dimensions as well as physical dimensions has just been something we haven't fully unlocked the potential of yet, but I see a lot of opportunity for using hierarchies to do that kind of thing. So as long as those kind of features and functions are a part of the future code line, how the guys build it and reinvent it in the background is probably, however that goes, right?
Doesn't matter, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I fully agree, and someone I spoke to earlier also mentioned something similar. So what I want to ask you is, I know, or I have seen the power of TM1's new hierarchies, the virtual hierarchies.
Right.
But it hasn't been fully utilized. Now, why is that? From your point of view, do you think it's because people don't know about it, or don't know enough about it, or not confident to make the jump? Or do you think because it requires a certain skill set that people don't have? Or is it a software thing? Like, why do you think it hasn't been fully utilized?
I think it's a bit of each of those things, to be fair. I think obviously if you've got an existing model that you've been working with for many years, even if you re-look at that model and say, hey, that could have been way better if hierarchies had existed at the time, the change management and the cost of rebuilding something that already works oftentimes is a barrier to doing that sort of thing. So I think on one side of things, that's probably why it's a slow uptake for existing clients. For newer clients, I think it's actually, you have to think about the design of your cubes a little differently than what you're used to. Totally. And so it's a mind shift that people have to go through. And I think it's not always automatic that you would go through that. And then it might be the nature of your business that determines how applicable it is. So things like the retail space, where you might have a dimension with thousands or hundreds of thousands or million different products or SKUs in your existing hierarchies, but you've then also got by color, by size, by demographic, by this, by that. That's the kind of application that's almost a no-brainer, right? I think there are other areas where maybe there's upside, maybe there's not, but things like that are the obvious ones that that you would want to get people excited about it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I hope, I mean, to your point, because it is a separate process. So what I mean by that is, people who inherit or build TM1 systems have been building TM1 systems. When they build a new TM1 system, whether it's going to use hierarchies, have to include a thinking process, because if you don't think about it, you're going to do it the old way, which means you are bypassing the advantage of hierarchies.
Right.
I hope more people will learn about it and will put that into their design process more often than not, so more people will see the benefit and more people can use it. Otherwise, it will become this great tool that's under the carpet that no one knows about.
It's certainly, I would say it's certainly one of the most underutilized or say underappreciated capabilities that exist today. And I agree with you 100%. I think if people can find a use case that is just sort of heading generally in that direction, it's really worth exploring it, because the advantages of it are significant.
Right, okay.
Yep.
Okay, now I've got a couple of more questions for you, because so far it's been very interesting. So I would like to hear, what is your vision for TM1 in the future? Do you think it's going to be the TM1 engine that we talked about, more focus on that? Or would that be something completely unrelated to the technical capabilities of TM1, like marketing and bring it to more people? Like, what's your view of TM1 in the future, as of now? Because it can change, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So I've been asked this question more than once, and I think my answer's always slightly different each time I answer it.
Yes.
But I think it's there's a whole bunch of like any other software. There's a whole bunch of layers to the stack of components that make up the end product. And I think the TM1 engine has been the area that's had the most attention over time, because it's the core of the whole product.
Of course.
And I think nothing's ever perfect. There's always room for improvement, and there's always room for making things better. But I would say the TM1 engine is a fairly complete organism, right, within that stack. For me, where there's always been some limits, and I guess for us at CubeWise, we've made some efforts to address this as well, is what's the user's experience that then takes all the value that you've got in that core engine and puts it on their desktop, right? And I think we can always do better with how we're presenting information to the end user. So I'm a little biased because I've worked a lot with things like the REST API. We've built applications with JavaScript and things like that. So I know that capability exists. And of course, there's a balance between those things as well, because it's not just how much effort it takes to build something, it's how long it takes to maintain something and modify it in the future. So for me, I think it's making an easy to use, very flexible and intuitive user interface. And I think we have pretty good content in that regard.
Yeah.
But I still think there's much more room for improvement from a user experience as well.
Great, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's like having the best engine. If you don't have a car to go with it, or a vehicle, then it's going to be only as good as what the vehicle or the chassis allows it to be, which could be a shame or hidden treasure. Yeah.
Right, and some of those aspects are going to be quite functional. Can I get the data I need quickly and intuitively? And some of it's very aesthetic, right? Some people, it's much more pleasing to look at numbers in a certain way than perhaps just on a flat grid with tiny little fonts and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So there's a design aspect to that. And I know we discuss that a lot, at our clients and internally as well, but there's certainly a design aspect to that is, what equals good design? What equals an intuitive environment? What works for person A? Does it also work for person B? And so you're looking for that best middle ground to suit everybody without limiting the capability of people at either ends of that,
Right,
spectrum, right?
That's important. That's harder said than done, isn't it?
And it's not
easier said than done, not harder said than done.
Right, but it's not always a technical problem either, right? It does come from that area of design, and one of the challenges that often we have as developers or consultants is we're thinking about solving the number problem, and solving the visual problem or solving the usability problem is not always coming from the same side of your brain, right?
No,
and,
yes.
And so that's where you maybe need help, or really, you need to spend more time on that other side. But no system works one or the other. It's not all about the numbers or all about the aesthetics. It's got to be the combination of the two, right?
Totally right. And I truly believe TM1 has everything it needs for those two to come together.
Yeah.
Consistently. And I guess anything that can help that consistency of these two great things come together,
Yeah.
I'll be all in for that.
Yeah.
Okay, now as a part of the series, now the official part is over. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As part of the series, we're trying to make it somewhat interesting, and I'm trying a new thing where the person I speak to get to ask the next person I'm going to speak to a question, and then you get to ask them a question. You get to ask the next question. Now, you can pass, of course, but you up for it? I will ask the question of what the last person asked me to ask you.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, if you have 3 wishes to improve the TM1 12 engine as we know it now, because it might be called something else later, is there any 3 things you would like to improve?
In the engine.
Or the product to TM1 12?
I would say I've always felt like we could make better use of attributes. I think attributes is effectively the two-dimensional or the sort of tabular or relational component of the functional model that we work with. I find accessing and presenting data that's held in attributes, there's certainly room we can do more there. So I'd like to see us doing more with attributes, which I guess is again perhaps more front end than engine, perhaps. But I would say that. Geez, I get 2 more wishes. I don't want to waste them. Yeah, I'm not sure if I know the answer to that. I might have to think about that when I come back to you. But
would it be something perhaps speed related, making it faster or more scalable or more accessible is the thing?
I think all those things are things that you would always want.
Yes.
No question about it. Anything that takes a second, you want to take a millisecond. Anything that takes a minute, you want to take a second. There's always going to be those challenges.
So I guess it will be how you rank them. So front end, certainly one, like with attributes.
Front end is certainly very, very high on my list for sure. Performance improvements is almost a given, I would say. I always used to say that there's a database in the future that's the actual perfect harmony between a functional database and a relational database. Because as much as we're working in the functional database space, and that suits the subject matter that we most commonly deal with, there's also great benefits to the way relational databases work as well, right?
True.
One's transactional and one's more about modeling and planning and reporting. But I feel like there's something in the future that smarter minds than me are going to come up with. It's the perfect blend of both a relational and a functional model, and taking all the best parts of both. Maybe there's some paradox that will prevent that from ever occurring. I'm not sure, but certainly there's a goal to be set.
I love that. I'm now gutted that I didn't think of that. That's brilliant. Okay. All right.
I'd love to be able to write a statement that's part SQL and part MDX. It gives me exactly what I want.
Okay. Well, I think you have one more wish, if you want to use that.
My one more wish is I wished I knew what else I wanted. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably everything I can think of.
Yeah. Well, these 2 wishes are already making significant changes. So
Yeah.
Okay then. What question would you like to ask the next person that's TM1 related?
I knew you were going to ask me that, so I was thinking about that at the same time, and I haven't yet cycled through that. What's the question I'd like to ask the next person? I think I came from something I saw earlier today around using Python as a default rather than using TI. And I hadn't really given that question a lot of thought in the past. It was this, I think one of our colleagues mentioned a Python first strategy.
I've heard
and I think certainly based on where we are and the renaissance for Python generally, I think it's a really compelling question to ask, why wouldn't you use Python first. Instead of, say, some combination of TI and Python or exclusively TI? And I think there'd be lots of different answers to that question, but I don't know what the answer is, and I'd love to hear what others have to say about that.
Okay, so the question is, what do the next person think about Python first,
Right.
as opposed to TI?
Almost, why wouldn't you use Python first over TI?
Okay, I like that. Okay, all right. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to ask that question to the next person.
Okay.
So one last thing, just for fun. Now, not really so TM1 related. All your thoughts to change the pace up a bit, because these podcasts they get a bit long, and sometimes people want more of an upbeat feeling after listening to podcasts. So what I try to do is I want to ask a series of rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Just very harmless ones.
All right, I'm getting ready.
Okay, all right. First thing comes to your mind, of course, no wrong answers, and no one's going to hold you to it. Okay, so first one is, what's your favorite color?
Blue.
Favorite food?
Pasta.
Favorite key on the keyboard?
Favorite key on the keyboard? I'd say the space bar.
Favorite TM1 function?
Favorite TM1 function? It's certainly not consolidate children, although it's a necessary thing at certain points in time. My favorite TM1 function? I think it's going to be cell put.
Cell put. Favorite TM1 rule?
Favorite TM1 rule in terms of a rule function or a rule that...
A rule, like a TM1 rule. It could be a function, yeah, it could be a rule. Anything in the rule file.
I would say FX translations and things like that are always fun to write in rules.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your favorite TM1 feature?
Favorite TM1 feature? I guess it's the sparsity algorithm, right? I know that's a bit of a...
that's good. Yeah, sparsity algorithm.
Yeah, I mean, it's the enabler, right? It's the enabler to everything else. So I say, yeah, the sparsity algorithm.
Okay, now, TM1 Web.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I spent many, many, many years of my career when TM1 Web was the only web-based user interface that existed on trying to perfect the perfect web sheet. And I think I've tried every possible way that you can do that.
Okay.
And I have fond memories of TM1 Web, but it's not my first choice of UIs anymore.
All right. PA Workspace.
PA Workspace had a slow start, but has had a fairly rapid increase in capability over recent times.
Okay. Now, what about first thought on TM1 Pi?
So I haven't done a lot with TM1 Pi. I love the idea of TM1 Pi, and I love the fact that you can integrate core TM1 with so much other content and functionality. I think that's amazing.
Integration. Okay. What about TM1 Horizon?
TM1 Horizon is amazing as well. 24 hours of TM1 fun and magic. Yeah, can't do anything better than that.
Great. Oh, thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Thank you for having me.
I know you don't do this a lot, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been really fun for me. I hope it wasn't too
Likewise.
bad for you.
I made it.
Yeah, you
Didn't have any injuries along the way. So yeah.
That's right. And we didn't do any retakes. So how about that? Yeah.
Fantastic. All
And
right.
well, if you like this type of content or you have questions for me and Mark, put them in the comments. Send us a message. We'd love to get back to you. And as usual, do good TM1. All right.
You've just listened to 15 minutes of TM1 with, brought to you by QWise, managing complexity in the business world.